So thank you so much for being here tonight for this conversation about, well, it's called Let's Talk About a Just Transition. My name is Jan Shaper. I'm the program director for the Arkansas Citizens Climate League. The League is a grassroots climate justice organization that is dedicated to empowering individuals and communities through engagement, education, and encouragement. And tonight's program, as I mentioned, is Let's Talk About a Just Transition. I want to remind everyone that we are recording, and I'm very excited that we have three distinguished panelists tonight, each of whom has deep roots in social and climate justice. Joanna Pearson-Mishner, give a wave, Shelley Bonayuta, and Dr. Paulette Meikle. And I have bios for each of them, and instead of telling you their bios, I'm going to be putting them in the chat. That was at their request so that they would have more speaking time with you. So I'll put those in the chat in a moment. But first, just a few housekeeping items. Each of our panelists will give about a 12-minute presentation. And if you have a question that comes to mind while they're speaking, please go ahead and put it in the chat, and we'll have time for your questions at the end and hopefully go deeper into our dialogue. And we are going to tonight really try and get a window into the why, what, and the how of a just energy transition. And we'll be starting with a macro view, and then we're going to shift and look a little bit at history and policy, and then bring it down to the local level. So I will be putting bios in the chat. Joanna Pearson-Mishner is going to kick it off for us. And I just want to tell you one sentence, that she is a mental health therapist and is soon to be ecotherapist, and she enjoys tending chickens in her backyard. Go, Joanna.
All right. Okay, so can everyone see that and everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so tonight I'm just going to talk with you pretty quickly. You know, as Jan says, this is kind of a fast-paced presentation for a really broad topic. So, but we're going to touch on current immigration and refugee movement that have climate factors contributing. And then we're going to look at human movement and climate-related projections as best we can. And then I've got a little bit of information for you about resilience planning and policy relevance, what the experts are recommending in terms of what kind of policies we need to have in place. And then we'll just look for a second at what's in store in terms of you know, energy and energy provision and what, you know, the decisions that we make relative to energy and how that's going to impact human decision making in terms of movement. So climate factors are one of several factors to influence the decision of individuals and families and communities in terms of human movement and the decision to migrate, which is a very difficult decision and, you know, is always multifactorial. So it's very complex. Other terms that are in the literature, you know, related to, a lot of times you see this term climate refugee, and then sometimes you see climate migrant. And that is a little bit of a contentious issue. And the reason for that is because we're talking about displaced people in which climate impacts are an enormous factor in their decision to move from their home countries or within a country from where they're from within that nation. And so, you know, some people, you know, some of the experts, some of the people who work in this arena, they really want to use the term climate refugees because they believe that, you know, this really shows the urgency, the sense of urgency, and that people don't always really feel like they have a choice. They don't really want to leave their homes. But strictly speaking, the UN's 1951 convention and the 1967 protocol from the UN only refers to those fleeing from persecution for issues of race, ethnicity, creed, or political belief. So the term refugee, strictly speaking from a legal perspective, is kind of an inaccurate term. And then some prefer migrant, but that's a more accurate term. However, it seems to indicate that people have some sort of a choice or volition in the matter, and that's just really not always the case. So if you look at human history, you see that climate and climate-related disasters, so particularly floods and droughts, have for many years throughout human history been a factor in terms of movement and migration. And we see here in more recent history, like with the Dust Bowl in the United States in the 1930s, there was migration, from the drought, and then the Chilean droughts of the 1970s and 80s. But climate migration is happening now. I mean, we know that it is, and it's long since been a major topic at the Conference of Parties annual climate meetings internationally. So, and the reasons for that are in terms of planning, in terms of provision for resources, livelihoods, how can we prepare? How can we prepare? What are the projections depending on the different greenhouse gas scenarios? And it's a difficult thing to study because, as I mentioned earlier, it's very complex. When you look at the complexity of the climate system itself and how difficult that can be to predict relative to the different greenhouse gas scenarios. And then you factor in human decisions and human behavior, and you can imagine that it is, the projections are difficult to have any assurance of accuracy about. But, the research is improving, the methods are improving. Most of the research, most of the data that we have comes from mostly qualitative data, so case studies and, interviews, but not so many, like surveys or quantitative data. So I wanted to share with you an experience that I had just to kind of highlight that interplay and that complexity and that multifactorial decision making, relative to human change and movement. And in 2012, I was asked to go to Niger by a NGO that I was volunteering with. They just wanted me to go and give a presentation about a livelihoods project that they were bidding for to work with the Tuareg people. And I said, sure, I'll go and do that. And, everything that I read going up to the trip, what I could find in the media and, from the UNHCR, who I was going to be speaking with, spoke quite a bit just about geopolitical unrest between Libya and Mali and Niger. But when I got there and I really started to talk to people more on the ground who work with the UN High Commission for Refugees and people there, and seeing actually the Tuareg people at these refugee settlements, I realized through those conversations that one of the major factors in the decision to move was drought. There was really severe drought that had been going on for a really long time. And if there's any, people group that could adapt to drought conditions, I think it would be the Tuareg people, because they are very resilient, they're nomadic, they know how to live in the desert. But what has happened over time, really over the last 10 to 15 years or so, the rainy season has gone from 5 months to 1 to 2 months out of the year. So you can just imagine how, what an impact that is for people. And so they're just running out of water. And it's not just related to climate change. One of the things it is, definitely, but one of the other factors was that, the French people are doing uranium mining in Mali. And so that's also taking a lot of water. So now something that's really interesting I looked into just recently is that the Tuareg people have predominantly been a matriarchal culture, but that's starting to shift a little bit because the men of the culture are leaving the area to find work because they're not really able to continue their own cultural ways of the past any longer because of this ongoing drought. And so they're leaving and they're coming back with more radical Islamic ideas. And so the culture is beginning to shift. So here's just some more recent statistics. In 2019, around 7 million people from 104 different nations and territories were living in displacement as a result of natural disasters. And the top 5 nations that were impacted were Afghanistan, India, Pakistan, Ethiopia, and Sudan. And natural disasters are the leading trigger of internal displacement. So that means like movement within a nation, the leading trigger. And then in 2020, the top 5 countries that accounted for more than 60% of this internal displacement was China, the Philippines, Bangladesh, India, and the United States. And we don't really know a whole lot. We don't have the data yet to really examine what's going on with cross-border movement related to disaster displacement and climate change. But in 2020, 75% of new internal displacement was triggered by natural disasters. And many would have moved also through those qualitative interviews. They discovered there was, the researchers discovered that more people would have moved if it hadn't been for COVID-19 concerns. But even despite people staying when they would have moved, disaster displacement was still the highest that had been in a decade in 2020. And that kind of brings us to what is going to happen at borders, as this continues, and depending on what we do with the greenhouse gas scenarios, and it really largely depends on what we do now at this time. But we look at Haiti and what just happened recently at the U.S. border, and a lot of what happened there again was multifactorial, and it wasn't so much contributed to climate change in the media. But if you look over the long term, there's a cumulative impact from hurricanes, drought, flood, intermittent. All of these conditions also contribute to poverty and the economy, the impacts that it's had on the economy there, as well as the ability for people to grow food. So most climate vulnerable nation in Latin America, Haiti is often referred to, for good reason. Again, I'm just pointing out here on the slide that there's multiple reasons for this, this migration, but climate is a factor, and decreased crop yields. And then, when there are these other geopolitical factors at play, climate change is a risk multiplier, right? The negative climate impacts. And so what this turned out to be, and even under the Biden administration, was that 4,000 Haitian migrants were sent back to Haiti without giving them the chance to seek asylum. So future projections, there's a wide range, right, out there. So, but experts are ranging, anywhere from 25 to 200 million and possibly more climate migrants by 2050, depending on what we do right now. And just to kind of put that in context, let me go back to that one for just a second. 200 million represents a 10-fold increase over today's entire documented refugee and internally displaced populations. That's about 1 in every 45 people, projected to be alive at that time, if that makes sense. So 1 in 45 people by 2050, if we're at that 200 million. And so some of the recommendations that I saw in the literature, and this is from a wonderful initiative between the University Network for Human Rights, the Harvard Law School's Immigration and Refugee Clinic, and Yale Law School's Environmental Law Association and Immigrant Justice Project. So all of these folks are working together to determine, like, what do we need? What do we need to do to prepare for what is, it's already happening. And, we're thinking there's definitely going to be more of this kind of migration and human movement in the future relative to climate change. What do we need to do? So some of the recommendations that they made are that United States policy in particular needs to change in terms of planning for weather events, because we tend to plan more for very acute, fast weather events. You think of like one hurricane, that sort of thing. And not to say that we don't need to improve that planning as well, but they're saying that we really don't plan for things like ongoing drought or year after year after year of wildfires, so that, that really needs to be revamped in the way that that's been typically done, because we're not there anymore. We're past that. And then the expanded temporary protected status. So temporary protected status is currently not granted to people who are leaving because of environmental displacement or climate related factors. And so they're saying that needs to be expanded. so that people can stay, in the United States if they need to for those kinds of factors. And to that end, there's the recommendation for the development of what's being called a climate visa. And this, allows people to come so that they can be safe and essentially have asylum, but, expand that definition to include people who are needing to move to provide for themselves and their families because of what's going on in their country, because of climate change and those impacts. So the path to citizenship should also be open with these climate visas if the conditions in their home countries don't improve. And then integrating climate change in the current asylum framework, which is also a recommendation that is from the UNHCR right now. That's something that they're thinking about doing. And that's a recommendation to them, to the broader UN and international policy and law. So, and then of course, increased research. So I mentioned, of course, what happens in the future related to to human migration is going to be determined by what we do now relative to greenhouse gas emissions and what scenario
Joanna,
we end up with. Yes.
It's Jan. Just a couple minutes left.
Okay.
Thanks.
Great. And then, also another factor is the rate of human population growth and distribution for other reasons. And then the meteorological evolution of climate change, of course, and then the effectiveness of local and national adaptation strategies. Because human vulnerability is not just determined by the severity of a weather event, it's also determined by the preparedness of that community beforehand. So, like, for instance, one factor, and it's not the only one, but it's a big one in the literature, is how much social capital was in that community prior to the disaster, because that makes a big difference in how vulnerable that community is and how they respond to that crisis. So if we know each other, if we are communicating with one another, if we've been planning in advance, or we just have close-knit relationships in those communities tend to fare better when there is a crisis than ones where people are living more isolated and they don't really know each other and they don't know what resources they have to share with one another. They don't know what skills each other has and things like that. So, and I just wanted to leave you with this quote. This is a wonderful article, and I do have a reference page, and I'm going to share this slide presentation with you. Jan's going to send it out. Thank you, Jan. So there's a lot more information out there than I could share with you in 10 to 12 minutes. But this is a wonderful article, The Great Climate Migration, from the New York Times. And I wanted to share this quote with you because it's kind of like a little case study. And I think it just really highlights what suffering people are going through in making these decisions to have to move. And this is already happening, all over the world with the Northern Triangle, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, to many places in Africa, to Afghanistan, to, all over, Asia. It's happening everywhere. But it just says early in 2019, a year before the world shut its borders completely, Jorge knew that he had to get out of Guatemala. The land was turning against him. For 5 years, it almost never rained. Imagine. Then it did rain, and Jorge rushed his last seeds into the ground. The corn sprouted into healthy green stalks, and there was hope. Until, without warning, the river flooded. Jorge waded chest deep into his fields, searching in vain for cobs he could still eat. Soon he made a last desperate bet, signing away the tin-roof hut where he lived with his wife and 3 children against a $1,500 advance in okra seed. But after the flood, the rain stopped again, and everything died. Jorge knew then that if he didn't get out of Guatemala, that his family might die too. Thank you. And then references. All right, I'm going to stop sharing.
That was so poignant, Joanna. Thank you.
Thank
you for giving us that powerful overview of the why we need to make a transition and why it needs to be a just transition. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Shelley Bonayuto of Fayetteville. I'll put her longer bio in the chat, but I just want to say that Shelley was one of the first people I met when I became an activist in the climate movement. And it was her wonderful welcome that helped me get through the door. So, Shelley, take it away, and you are muted. Jelly, you're still muted. Let's see if I can get you unmuted.
I got
Yes.
stuck in technology hell. So sorry. Okay, let me see. Okay, there we go. Now I lost my share screen. Oh,
Take your time. It would not be a league event if we didn't have some kind of technological glitch. So thank you
there
for
we go.
making it happen.
There we go. Okay.
We're screen sharing. Where's
Now
the
am I
link?
screen sharing?
Yes, you are. That's
Okay.
good.
Yeah.
Wait a minute. Okay. Sorry, everybody, about that. I just wanted to say that I saw promise in Jan, and now you can see why. I mean, she's helping us technologically here so greatly. I fell in love when I read Dr. Shalonda Baker because I saw in her someone who deeply understood the intersection of racism and climate change, because racism can be a direct cause of climate change. She understood it so perfectly. And when I found her book, Revolutionary Power, I knew I had to share this. In this book, she arms those made most vulnerable by our current energy system with the tools they need to remake the system. She argues that people of color, poor people, and indigenous people must engage in the creation of the new energy system in order to upend the unequal power dynamics of the current system. She is a leading expert on environmental and energy law. She taught at Northwestern and is currently Deputy Director for Energy Justice at the Department of Energy. Her book, Revolutionary Power, was published in 2021. She also wrote a paper which is shorter, 79 pages, very, very readable. Jan will put it in the chat. It's called Anti-Resilience. You'll see what anti-resilience means if you read the article. I had to begin with this slide, even though it's not in the book, because when I first started to understand and learn about the intersection of racism and climate change, I knew it began with the Industrial Revolution, because that's when climate change really began to spike. And it was due to the enslavement of Blacks, of Africans, and also the genocide and the stealing of the land of the indigenous. The energy of enslaved Black Africans initially powered the engine of the cotton industry, and the risks and externalities of the energy system continue to disproportionately burden Black and Black bodies, low-income bodies, people of color bodies. The hierarchies that privileged white property owners over landless laborers stayed firmly intact as the Industrial Revolution ignited the ascendance of fossil fuels, leading to unprecedented ecological degradation and climate change. This is a direct quote from her that is hugely important for those of us who have been working in the climate movement. For many who feel the imminence of the climate disaster, as we all do, and who believe that the time to act on climate was last century, which it was, the idea of pursuing justice-oriented aims as we tackle climate change seems unwise, slow, and unwieldy. Their instinct is to focus first on shoring up the base and pick the lowest hanging fruit and easy solutions to lower carbon emissions. I am not at odds with these people, but I would suggest that they look at the evidence. pitfalls. The easy climate solutions might actually threaten to leave marginalized communities even more marginalized in the face of climate change. Some large-scale renewable energy projects displace and divide indigenous communities and rural communities and have cumulative environmental impacts on ancestral land. She writes about this, examples of this in her book. Corporate and financial interests that played a large role in developing and financing the fossil fuel-oriented projects that led to the current climate disaster jockey for space to maintain influence in the renewable energy economy, seeking to profit off the disaster they created. Here's some examples. The Formosa plastics plant. And corporate interests are wrongly claiming that NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, which requires a review of impacts that industry would have on communities. They're wrongly claiming that NEPA stands in the way of a green energy grid, expanded mass transit, and other aspects of a green economy. The cynical ploy is obvious: cast climate action and environmental justice is incompatible and insists that one be sacrificed. Jan also put a link about NEPA in the chat. I just got some new information about the way NEPA has been weakened in the new infrastructure bill. I'll be happy to share that with you. Port Arthur, Texas was especially important to Shalonda Baker because her father worked at Entergy there. This quote is from Dr. Robert Bullard, considered the father of environmental justice. Our political, economic, governmental, legal, and military institutions effectively sanction environmental racism through public policies and industry practices that provide benefits for whites while shifting costs to people of color. I just found this on Inside Climate News. Resistance to lithium, America's plans to dig an element critical to the energy transition at Nevada's Thacker Pass shows that clean energy could face the same challenges as fossil fuels. So this is, again, using or exploiting indigenous lands for materials that we will need for our renewable economy. Revolutionary Power makes three central claims. First, energy connects to every aspect of life, and the energy system defines nearly every aspect of socioeconomics and health. Second, the transition away from the fossil fuel-driven energy system offers an opportunity to upend existing socioeconomic inequality and foster lasting structural change. Third is to situate the technical domain of renewable energy policy within a broader civil rights discourse concerning inequality and access to justice. Further, Black, Indigenous, and people of color must serve as the architects of the new system to upend the embedded and unequal power dynamics. This revolution must be fought on the unfamiliar terrain of energy law and policy. This is a book that Shalonda Baker mentions in Revolutionary Power, Energy Democracy. It's a compilation of citizen initiatives around the country that are working on getting energy democracy, solar projects, et cetera, in their communities. So what is energy democracy? It's a strategy for taking control and ownership of energy resources out of the hands of the energy establishment, democratizing energy, and making it a vital resource for advancing the environmental, economic, and social justice needs of our communities. These are a couple of citizen initiatives mentioned in the book. One Voice Electric Co-op trainings, that's in Jackson, Mississippi, and they gave 6-month trainings to members of rural electric co-ops and how the co-op operates and how to run for the board. The resistance to the Chevron Richmond refinery in 2008 brought $15 million annually to the city from a standard utility tax that they forced Chevron refinery to pay. This is not in the book, the Arkansas Third Party Solar Act, but it has really incentivized the development of solar in Arkansas. In fact, I just heard that since 2015, Arkansas has increased solar by 1,995%. We can also have low-income community solar installations owned and controlled by the community here. It's legal, I checked. The Arkansas Advanced Energy Association is working on a community solar project now. More on community energy. The scale of the energy matters. Small scale energy systems avoid negative community impacts. Community control matters. Local people can determine project locations, and in some cases, it's the source of the energy. Ownership also matters and maximizes local economic benefits. You're not paying the money to a third party. I love this sign. Communities of color are the most polluted, so why don't we have the most solar panels? The problem, of course, is lack of access to credit. A lack of access to credit and resources to finance clean local energy poses the most significant barrier to low-income participation in the energy transition. These access issues not only stem from the legacy of redlining and racist perceptions of credit worthiness, but also from tax incentive programs that privilege the wealthy. The federal investment tax credit incentivizes only those with sufficiently high incomes to participate, and I know that from personal experience. So she came up with an innovative idea how to free up income. Place a cap on the percentage of overall income that low to moderate income households pay for energy. The policy could also set a flat minimum payment rate for higher income customers. For any energy use beyond a certain predetermined usage, the higher income household would pay an additional fee. Although this formulation is somewhat radical, and I can imagine not that popular in some sectors, it is the true meaning of equity. In fact, some utility reform advocates have already quietly begun to advocate for such policy design. Such a policy would free up 15 to 25% of real income for the lowest income utility customers, who typically also bear the most substantial environmental burdens of the energy system. This is a tale of two fuels. This is the nation's highest CO2 coal plant in Monroe County, Georgia, surrounded by a population of 2,324 people, of whom 20% are Black, 13% are Hispanic, and 48% are low income. Highly toxic coal burning electrical generation units have historically been situated in lower density areas. This is a natural gas burning plant, the second highest CO2 emitting natural gas plant, also in Georgia, is surrounded by 60,340 people, of whom 40% are Black, 8% are Hispanic, and 25% are low income. This was from a paper called Green for All. Jan put the link in the chat. And as part of their research, they studied what would happen if carbon emissions were lowered without taking into account environmental justice. Transitioning to renewables would probably incentivize the use of natural gas as a bridge fuel. When decarbonization policy explicitly incorporates air quality and environmental justice objectives into its design, the result is a very substantial reduction in the co-pollutant damages from gas-fired power plants compared to the carbon alone scenario. As probably most of you know, co-pollutants like sodium dioxide, nitrous oxide, and particulate matter 2.5 are the causes of the extreme ill health in many frontline communities. The cost of meeting these clean air and environmental justice goals is on the order of 5% more than the cost of a decarbonization focused exclusively on carbon alone. Her conclusion: the current energy transition holds great promise to dismantle deep-seated legacies of racism and oppression. I remain hopeful that state by state, those responsible for energy policy will see its vast potential to restructure harmful social relationships that we've come to regard as normal and natural. But even if those with the power to do this work do not act, I have hope that the many civil rights and social justice organizations serving frontline communities will come to see the transformative potential of this energy transition. Oh no, now I'm not able to stop. There we go.
Look at you go. Wow, Shelley, thank you. And I really appreciate how Shelley, you and Joanna both put these very powerful quotes at the end of your presentations. They just really provide an emotional sense of what is at stake for individuals and families, communities in the United States and around the world as we think about how we are going to get from a carbon intensive economy and transition to clean energy. So thank you very much.
Yeah, I just let me say that I'm finding more and more people who are saying we cannot solve the climate issue without racial equity. The intersection is too deep.
Thank you. And I did put the links that Shelley mentioned in the chat, and invite everyone to share the chat if that's useful to you. Just a reminder, you can share the chat, or sorry, save the chat by clicking the 3 buttons on the right at the bottom of the chat when you open it. And now we will go to Dr. Paulette Meikle. And while Dr. Meikle is getting up her slides, I invite everyone just to take a quick stretch, get the blood flowing. Lots of ideas to think about. If you have comments, questions, please put them in the chat. I'm going to do one more stretch because it feels good.
Well, thank you so very much then, Jan, but I'm not going to be sharing my slides immediately. I'm going to have a quick chat and then move to the slides. Shall I go now?
Please. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Oh, and I will put your, put your bio in the chat. I do have to say, Paulette, that as way of introduction, beyond just talking about slides, I do want to point out that one of the, I don't go on social media that much except beyond what I do for climate, but one of the highlights for me of going on my Facebook feed is when Paulette posts one of the new pieces of art that she's created, her paintings. So I invite you to reach out to her on Facebook so you can enjoy the beautiful color schemes that she puts together and the alluring imagery. So thank you.
You're so very kind. Thank you, Jen, and good evening, everyone. I'm so delighted to be part of this important conversation on energy justice. So as Shelley just said, the work of Shalonda Baker is so important, and in her work, she argues that energy justice focuses on the ways in which communities should have a say in shaping their energy futures, as well as ensuring that the policies that we're developing, particularly in this moment of energy transition, do not inequitably impact the most marginalized of communities. So in the arena of energy justice then, equity should indeed drive policy. According to the Institute of Policy Studies, almost 1/3 of American households face energy insecurity. Low-income families are disproportionately affected by energy poverty. In fact, 44% of low-income households experience energy insecurity compared to 2% of those that are not low income. The data, as you can imagine, are even more concerning for people of color. Here's the enigma. The very people who cannot afford the benefits of our energy system are paying a disproportionate share of its costs, as shown by their higher exposure to pollution and higher rates of pollution-related illnesses, as Shelley just pointed out. So therefore, thinking about the local context and how we can come up with solutions, I argue that universities and local community organizations have a huge role to play in energy justice. Therefore, I call on universities like UFS to be part of the solution by intentionally promoting equity dimensions in our transition away from fossil fuels. They indeed can help to dismantle blocked opportunity structures, starting at the local level. I argue that corporations and universities have a responsibility to address the energy needs and conditions of people from marginalized communities who face the double burden of energy insecurity and energy-related pollution. So as intellectual leaders, universities are increasingly mindful of their social responsibility. In that context, then, they can deliberately strive for equity in the energy system, establishing meaningful relationships with stakeholders and community partners, and being the channel for diverse people's access to theirs who are living in their service regions. So universities are often located around and among communities at the front line of pollution and climate change. So these, what we call them, as Shalonda mentioned, frontline communities who bear the brunt of energy sector externalities. The working class, indigenous communities, tribal nations, and historically disenfranchised racial and social inequity groups. And I won't go in depth with that because Shelley did such a beautiful job in addressing that. But from where I sit as someone who is in higher education, these groups are often disconnected from the ivory tower culture and opportunities of universities. So this prompts me to pose two provocative questions. So these questions are: first, can universities help to make energy accessible, affordable, clean, and democratically allocated for all communities? Can universities help just and equitable energy policies and practices? So let us interrupt conventional wisdom. We can challenge universities in community engagement with energy justice. I am pleased to know that there are numerous examples across the US Academy. At the University of Michigan, there is an energy justice program, and this program explores the intersection of energy and equity issues and looking at ways to rectify persistent unequal distribution of energy resources to ensure reliable, clean, and affordable energy access. At Indiana University, there's the Energy Justice Lab. So that says it all. They focus on equity and justice dimension of the energy transition. At Cornell University, they have an energy justice program which explores an equitable energy transition. At MIT, they bring students together with alumni and professionals to discuss topics on the forefront of energy transition. At Penn State Law School, there's a Green Energy Law and Energy Justice program. And at the University of Maine, there's a US Community Energy Program. And this one is particularly interesting because it's a centralized location, a repository of sorts for information sharing about if you want to engage in these community energy projects, they can provide help for you. So not only that, I'm pleased, and I've asked Jan to put a link to this EPA website for you. I'm very pleased, as I did a bit of audit across the internet, to see that there are over 120 green power communities in the United States. So this is essentially, and she's going to provide that link for you if you have time to have a look at these communities. You'll be very pleased to see what's going on across the United States. So if I do have time to come back, I can pull those up and we can have a discussion about the progress, the extensive work in the direction of clean energy across the country. So for now, I'm going to talk about, so we often at the university, we have a lot of theoretical ideas and we write papers all the time. But I really, as a community development professor in my former school, I always argue that let's do community-based research where we actually not only doing the research, but we are also promoting actual community projects. And I argue again that universities like UFS are replete with the intellectual dexterity and power and influence to lead work in the energy transition. They can work with communities in their service regions and local organizations in breaking down barriers to energy justice through community engagement. So my colleagues and I have stressed, and my colleagues I mean in this discussion tonight, the importance of case studies. I argue that we should be a case study ourselves in the River Valley. Thus, I boldly propose local revolutionary power in the River Valley. And this I call the River Valley Green Energy and Education Program. It says RV Geek. And if you permit me a minute, I'll go ahead and share my slides and show you what I have put together some thoughts to share as an action proposal. And now let's see. Can you see my screen? Yeah? Okay, great. And so with the River Valley Green Energy and Education Program, come on, this is a proposal. We can change as much as we want later on should we take up the challenge that I present to you tonight. So this RV GEEP would be a partnership between the League, the CCL, and UFS that would form a primary energy development organization in the River Valley region. It would be home for a variety of energy equity programs serving communities across the River Valley, developing green energy community partnerships across the River Valley. Of course, we take advantage of green energy, establish educational programs, and change the culture of energy usage in the River Valley. Of course, the aim is to reduce dependency on conventional energy generation. So some principles I've come up with: we would champion green energy education in the River Valley. We would champion energy justice. We would encourage community and institutional partnerships. We would champion the social, economic, and environmental welfare of all people. So oftentimes when we think about these projects, I'm a sociologist, as Jan mentioned. We tend to forget about, and I heard Joanna talk about social capital. We tend to forget about incorporating the people, the social elements for any kind of projects like this. So for that, I argue that we can use the Collective Action Initiatives Framework by Greg et al. And Jan is going to be so kind as to send you a summary of that and where you can actually find the actual paper. So here's a framework that I propose for this RV GEEP project. It's based on collective action initiatives. It's a form of social innovation in the energy sector that's based on social movement, mobilizing people. It's collective action, as it suggests. But first, we begin by looking at who are the people who are interested, who are motivated, and who have the values for social equity, energy equity, and so on. And look at the typologies of CAI, that's collective action initiatives, that we have in our community, and look at internal and external resources to bring those all together for mobilization in this collective action. But of course, we would be a little bit, I think, slight if we did not think about opportunities and threats that are external. What are the regulatory frameworks? What are those systems that govern corporate participation in the fossil fuel industry? And as you can see here, and you will get a chance to delve a little bit deeper, when we think about community energy, there are two main dimensions to consider: the project process and the outcome dimensions. And again, I have to insert that both of these two dimensions are mediated by the people factor, the mobilization of the people. Not only that, but okay, so giving voice to the marginalized, but also looking at the power structure, those who have influence, who can actually move the needle, who can actually provide funding, who can actually help with the research process. So our aim is to get the process to the open, the top side of things and not closed. So these closed elements are based on individual landowners installing wind turbines. But as we get more open and bring more benefit to the broader community, we would have collectively owned roof solar panels. So I'm going to leave that for now. And in terms of participation at the community level, this would lead to a higher level of participation. I'm going to leave that for now and I'll get into the weeds of that. and see what else we can talk about in thinking about an actual action project. So we'll emphasize the social aspect as essential. This is sometimes overlooked when we're looking at the energy transition policies and programs and initiatives. But it's also important to have a nuanced understanding, a contextual understanding of the dynamics between local communities and the energy transition. Communities are very different in the composition of resources they have and how they respond to different challenges. So as I mentioned, citizen initiatives, collective action initiatives are going to be imperative, social movements, in addition to the social technical transitions. So the technical elements of all of this obviously is crucial, but it's an intersection between social movements, the people element, and technical transitions as well. So the transition should also recognize social movements and how they affect cultural values and beliefs in society. Again, oftentimes in my research, when we talk about change and bringing forth new initiatives, we never think about the cognitive elements of social change. And that's oftentimes, I think Joanna could help me with this, the hardest part to change. How do we change people's mindset? Even when policies change, we tend to have people still holding on to the old because we have cultural lag. And that's basically what this theory, what this framework is arguing.
And Paulette, I'm going to just, we have about 2 minutes left because I want to leave a couple minutes for questions. Thank you so much.
Certainly. So the change in community culture would begin with the leadership of the CCL, the League, UAFS, and other community partners. So I isolated, just to bring some sense of some meat to it, I actually wrote down 6 different goals, and under each goal, I described exactly how they would be implemented, which I won't have time to do tonight. But I'll be glad to share those with you. So the first goal would be to create a UAFS demonstration program that can serve as a prototype of community energy projects. The second goal would be cultivating green energy partnerships within the River Valley area. The third goal would be to, publicity. Look, the greatest energy that we can develop around a particular project like this, the better it is for us. How do we do it? Through broadcasts and different media. And the fourth goal would be to develop and implement the plan to install solar energy projects in selected homes in the River Valley, low-income communities of color. And the fifth story, to extend the green energy partnerships beyond the River Valley, of course. And the sixth goal would be to implement green energy installation in partner homes and offices. So the big question then is, well, how are we going to pay for all of this? Of course, that's a big question. Federal and state grants, I did a bit of search for myself to see what opportunities exist out there. There are some federal and state grants supporting green energy projects. The corporate world, maybe we can argue for those who are more green oriented that they'll be willing to work on a project like this. And of course, foundations. Thanks so very much.
I have goosebumps just listening to that.
Oh,
The possibilities.
Thanks so much.
And just a follow-up question for you, Paulette, because I haven't seen any questions yet in the chat. As an associate dean at UAFS, what would you say is kind of the sense or the urgency on campus among students and faculty, administration in terms of climate change and how it's impacting the local community?
Well, that's an excellent question that I wish I had some really good data, solid data to answer. But anecdotally, I know before COVID-19, there's a bit of energy where I even worked with a student on the sociology of climate change. And there's a bit of energy with the chemistry club. There's Earth Day celebrations that would focus on climate change. But right now, I do not know where I don't know, I haven't done a scan of the radar, but all of what we're talking about cannot come to fruition without leadership. And all we need are leaders and advocates and professors who will say, okay, this is such an important issue. Let's restructure curriculum. Let's get the student clubs to begin to understand and the importance of this. But right now, I don't have really the big picture factual ideas for you or picture for you, Jan.
Well, I appreciate you, though, scoping out what a path forward could be to ignite and assess the interest in the UAFS community.
Certainly.
Thank you so much. And Joanna, jumping back to you, when we first started meeting Dr. Miguel and Shelley and you and I about this project, you really were focusing on the macro of why do we really need to get going on a just transition? What are the pushing factors? And I was wondering what inspired you or moved you to focus on displacement and migration?
Yeah, I think it's because I was just thinking about climate justice struggles. And, I think that migration and the factors that influence people's decisions to leave their own homes is a huge climate justice and environmental justice problem that we're facing as a species all over the planet right now. And we see that right here in Northwest Arkansas with the immigration to this area. With we have the Marshallese community here that it's just marvelous to have them here. But climate was a factor in that shift as well. And so I think about that. I also think about the generational injustice. So we've got nations that are the largest contributors to greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And then we have, people groups, predominantly in the global South, but not just the global South, also, in Latin America, and who are being, severely impacted by climate change outcomes, who are the least contributors to the problem. Yeah. So I was trying to highlight that, but I think I got pretty heavy into the data and the movement, the numbers, and all of that. Didn't necessarily bring that out as much as I had originally intended. So thank you for the question.
Yeah, what the information you provided really, it provides a sense of the urgency of taking action, and it can't help but, I think, evoke our compassion for people around the world and in this country. And Shelley, we have 1 minute left, and I just want to give you a shout out because you were really the energy behind this this presentation, this gathering, after reading Shalonda Baker's book. And what aspect of that book, what key idea would you like to leave the group with tonight?
Key idea is that most of us do not realize how we, as mostly white middle class, have benefited from the energy usage from the burning of fossil fuels and comforts in our homes, while people in frontline communities have been suffering for years and years with ill health and with poverty, and have been subject to being unable to live anywhere else because of redlining and other racist policies that have forced them in this condition. And it's totally inequitable. And we will not be able to solve the climate crisis as long as this inequity continues, because this inequity allows the pollution and the continued emission of carbon without proper regulation.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you everyone so much for being here, for showing up on a beautiful Wednesday evening, autumn in Arkansas. And we will be sending, our presenters have graciously agreed to share their slide presentations. So we'll be sending those out to you all. And remember, you can save the chat, but I will also be sending out the links. I hope you had a chance to read our presenter bios, and want to thank each of them for all the time they put into bringing this, their passion and their knowledge and wisdom to you. Thank you everyone so much for coming to this League event, and have a wonderful evening.
Great presentation.
Good night.
Good
Thanks
night.
for that, Charles. Thanks for that shout out to the presenters. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you.